Well, ahoy, mateys. I'm Captain Steve. And you know, I'm thinking about the river, specifically the Red River of the North. You know, I've always enjoyed this river, and I was wondering, why are other people drawn to the Red River of the North? Well, that's the story that I would like to tell you about today. The Red River of the North. Now, our Red River is here running between Minnesota and North Dakota and going all the way up to Canada. But why did that happen? Well, that happened because of Lake Agassiz, a giant glacial lake that melted and created the Red River and also left behind a lot of different lakes around our region. Now, that was a mere 15,000 years ago. A lot of people were drawn to the river even then. Probably the first people who came out here were some natives, the Native Americans that were here. Some of them came thousands of years ago, and well, we don't even know their names. But they were drawn to the river because the river also had animals around it. Of course, it had fish, and these people had to fish, and they had to hunt, and they had to rely on animals to make their living. And so they came out here to this valley. Well, at that time, we don't even know what kind of language they spoke. We don't even know their names. But the later people who were drawn to this river, these Native Americans, we do know their names. And many of them were living alongside the river or coming up here to do some hunting or trapping, and they left behind artifacts, and that's how we know they were here. Now, I do not know what these Native Americans called the Red River. I have no idea. But I do know what some men who came after the natives called it. And these men were trappers. They came down mostly from Canada. A lot of them had fathers who were French Canadian and mothers who were Native American. And so they spoke mostly French, but also a combination of French and some Indian languages. Now, these men came down to trap. Mostly they came to trap the animals that they would find right next to or living nearby the Red River of the North. They knew they were up here in the northern part of the country, and when these Frenchmen first looked at this river, they enjoyed the color of it. It was sort of a brownish red, sort of a maroon, not real red, but sort of a reddish tint to it. That probably happened when the sun was able to shine down on it. And because of the bottom of the river has a lot of red silt and clay, when it gets all stirred up, it has sort of a reddish brown look. Well, these trappers, speaking their French, looked at this river. Now, first of all, in French, they called a river the rivière. And when they saw the color was sort of red, they used the French word for red, rouge. So they called it the rivière rouge. And to say of the north, they said du nord. That was French. So they said rivière rouge du nord. Later on, when the English people came, they heard rivière rouge du nord, and they said, well, we know what that means. That means Red River of the North. And that is why we call the river the Red River of the North. And that's named because these Frenchmen were the first ones to see it and give it a name that we know about. Well, all sorts of things would come down to the river, as I mentioned. Animals who lived here, and of course the fish. And people gather where there's water. We do that, obviously, because we need water to survive. Without water, we're going to die. Well, years ago, in the 1840s and 1850s, let's imagine what these riverbanks looked like around here. Over here on the Dakota Territory side, it was called Dakota Territory because we weren't the state of North Dakota yet. And over here on the other side, the eastern side of the Red River, which was called first Minnesota Territory and then later on the state of Minnesota, there were people using this river, just like the Frenchmen, to use small boats and go up and down the river, or canoes, taking furs maybe that they had trapped down here. Well, people that got the goods and the services, all the fur that was being caught by these trappers, were down there in the city of St. Paul. And they looked up at this Red River and they said, you know, I think it'd be a great idea if we could get riverboats up on that Red River. They said, why don't we give a prize? Let's give some money. Let's say $1,000 to any man who will build a riverboat and put it on the Red River of the North. Well, one man who was living down in the St. Paul area thought that that sounded like a pretty good idea. And his name was Anson Northup. Now, Anson Northup must have been quite a thinker, because he looked at this river up here and he knew that there wasn't anything such as a riverboat on the Red River of the North. But he said, I'm going to be the man that is going to put the first riverboat up there on the Red River. And so Anson Northup bought another riverboat down there in St. Paul. And he took it apart and he shipped it up overland and went up to the Red River Valley, because it was his idea to create the first steamboat on the Red River, plus pick up that $1,000 prize that those men down in St. Paul had offered. And so Anson Northup would become the first captain of a riverboat on the Red River of the North. And he took that overland and took that riverboat that he had taken apart and he put it back together on the land. And pretty soon that riverboat was being put right on the Red River of the North. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about that first riverboat. Now, Captain Anson Northup thought he might be the first one to have traffic on the Red River. Although it wasn't exactly like that, because before he brought his new steamboat out, these same trappers had made big wooden carts near the Red River. And on those carts, they would load the fur that they had trapped, and those carts would roll down next to the river with big wooden wheels. In fact, the whole cart was made of wood. And when they got to the river, they could actually float the cart on the river. They could take the wheels off, and that cart could float in the water. They would pull the cart out, put back the wheels, and then it would get pulled again by a big old oxen. And they were called Red River ox carts. Really, the only kind of transportation that was near and on the river then, before the steamboats, were the Red River ox carts. Even got their name. So now Anson Northup is going to bring his steamboat and get that all prepared to go out on the river. And oh my goodness, what a wonderful steamboat that was. Well, it had been called the North Star when he bought it, but because he was inaugurating it as a brand new means of transportation and business up on the Red River, he decided to give it a new name. Well, he probably wasn't a real modest man either, because he called his steamship the Anson Northup, and he put his name right on the side of that old steamship. Now, it ran with steam, of course, which means that there was a big engine that was burning wood or coal, and that engine would create heat, which would create steam, and all that steam would come out these giant smokestacks on the river boats. And people would gather on the Anson Northup, and they would go up and down the river, and people could see the black smoke belching from the belly of the engine and coming up the smokestacks, and people saw that smoke above the trees between these two communities, and they knew that the steamboat was on its way. They loved to see that steam, those big old black plumes of steam. Well, the Anson Northup was the first steamboat to come up on the Red River of the North, but soon there were many others. And over there in the little town that was called Burbank on the Minnesota side, pretty soon steamboats were being made. Well, to make steamboats, you need people to move in and make them. And they were putting docks out in the water, and they were building buildings. And pretty soon, different sort of steamboats were being built right in Moorhead. Moorhead had been renamed from Burbank. And now these giant steamboats were being built right in Moorhead, right down by the river. Wouldn't that have been fun to see back in those days? And these steamboats would bring goods and services and supplies and tractors and people and fur, of course, and they would be going up and down the Red River of the North. And I suppose people would, walk down to the river and see these big old steamboats puffing along. And of course, that Red River of ours is very windy as it goes from Wahpeton all the way up to Winnipeg in Canada. And people would gather and they would look at the steamboats and all the people on them and probably wave to them and say, "Well, look at that, the steamboats are coming." And this was part of the age of the steamboat on the Red River of the North. Well, of course, that age would have to come to an end, just like the age of the Red River ox cart came to an end. The age of the steamboat would come to an end. And that was because of another steam engine. But this time, the steam engine that was going to come to the Red River would not actually be going on the Red River. The next steam that was going to be coming to the Red River of the North was going to be the steam locomotive. And so the mighty steam locomotive was a brand new way that people could get across the country, brand new way of transportation. They could now travel in great numbers. They could do it, by spending a little bit of money, but not a great deal of money. And that was good because people didn't have much money in those days. And so they could travel from one spot in the United States to another spot in the United States because of the train. And this particular train that figures so prominently in our history was going to be running across this northern part of the country, just like the Red River of the North. This train was going to be going from Duluth, Minnesota, and go all the way out past the Red River of the North, through Dakota Territory, and all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And so that railroad would lay down its ties along the land and then lay down the rails over the ties, and they actually made their own road their railroad. And of course, the train would go on the railroad and start coming through. And because this particular train was going to go across the northern part of the country out to the Pacific Ocean, they called it the Northern Pacific. For short, they just called it the NP. And that NP came in here, and that would also help change history. So when the NP came over here to Minnesota and looked across the Red River of the North, that River Rouge du Nord, as the French would say, they looked over to the Dakota Territory side. And they knew they had to get their train over the river. So, of course, they built a bridge. And when they built that bridge, it was the first bridge that had been put over the mighty Red River of the North. And the railroad bridge, because they had built that primarily for the train to come across, was now able to bring the two little towns, the two new towns, Moorhead, Minnesota, and Fargo, Dakota Territory, together. Now, they also built a smaller bridge next to the railroad bridge. This was a bridge for people to cross. We didn't have, we didn't have cars or buses back then. Some people might have had horse-drawn wagons or horses, but people could walk along that bridge as well. But in 1872, the Northern Pacific Railroad came across the river, and they would now span these two communities between Fargo and Moorhead. And then now there would be train traffic going over the mighty Red River of the North. Well, just as the Red River ox carts had to be replaced by the steam boats, the railroad, the steam locomotive, replaced the riverboats. And soon, more businesses started to move into these two communities. Fargo began to grow, and, well, so did Moorhead. They both got larger. And after a while, there was no more need to have riverboats on the Red River. But, of course, the only reason that Fargo and Moorhead and this surrounding area would exist was because of the water. The water here, left by Lake Agassiz and now in the Red River of the North. People are drawn to water. Homes are drawn to water. Businesses are drawn to water. Just like animals are drawn to water, everything in our life pretty much revolves around water. And that, to me, is why the Red River of the North has this marvelous, marvelous history. And it seems to me that that is the major reason why we have to take care of our water. That's important for all of us. Because, to put it very simply, if we as human beings do not have water, we will no longer exist. So you see, the Red River and water is mighty important to me, and, well, I hope it's important to you too.